Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere damp, musty, and just a little bit unsettling. The cellar of a medieval tavern. Imagine yourself at the top of a narrow stone staircase, hand trailing along the rough wall as you take the first cautious step downward. It smells faintly of barley husks, wood smoke, and something sour you can't quite place. You breathe in, knowing full well that people back then relied on these underground spaces for their daily drink. And without it, you probably wouldn't survive long. Water was dicey at best. Ale, by contrast, was safer, smoother, and, most importantly, it didn't carry quite as many parasites as the village well. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing the little constellation of times and places come together across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You reach the bottom of the stairs and the air changes. It's cooler, heavier, with a dampness that clings to your clothes. The torchlight flickers across rows of wooden casks, their iron hoops glinting dully. Some barrels are pristine, sealed tight. Others bulge in odd places, like they've been holding secrets for centuries. You spot a few cobwebs spanning the corners, threads trembling when the draft sneaks through the cracks in the door above. A mouse scurries past your boot, giving you a look as if to say, "Yes, you're in my world now." Brewing in the Middle Ages was both art and necessity. Every village needed ale. It was calorie-rich, provided hydration, and kept workers going from dawn until dusk. But the cellar wasn't just storage. It was the living heart of fermentation. The temperature stayed steady underground, ideal for yeast to do its mysterious work. And yeast, in those days, was mysterious indeed. Brewers didn't talk about microorganisms. They talked about God is good, a charmingly vague explanation for why some batches bubbled into frothy life while others soured into vinegar. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers truly understood consistency, or if every mug was a gamble. Some claim the guilds guarded their practices fiercely, while others think it was mostly luck, stirred with superstition. And here you are, ducking beneath low beams, brushing aside the cobwebs, and taking in that mingled scent of wood, damp stone, and grain. It's not glamorous. It's not even particularly clean. But this is where the week begins. A drip echoes somewhere in the shadows. You tighten your grip on the torch and take another breath. The floor is uneven, patched with straw to soak up spills. Rats? Certainly. Mold? Almost guaranteed. But this is the space you'll be calling your workplace. The barrels lean against each other like old friends, whispering secrets of past feasts, weddings, and nights when the ale ran out too soon. Somewhere above, muffled laughter and a faint clatter of mugs remind you that the cellar isn't isolated. It's the quiet muscle behind the tavern's noisy pulse. As you stand among the casks, you can't help but wonder what surprises the week will hold. Brewing isn't just about stirring and waiting. It's about carrying, hauling. You wake the next morning to the muffled sounds of clanging from above, the innkeeper already barking orders, benches scraping, and the faint crackle of a hearth being stoked. But down here in the cellar, it's quieter. The hum of the tavern softened into a distant vibration through the beams. Your job today is simple on paper. Start the mash. That means hauling barley that's been soaking overnight and mixing it into a warm slurry, the base of what will, with luck and time, become ale. Simple on paper, but in practice, well, let's just say your back may not thank you. The sacks of barley are stacked in a corner, dusty and heavy. You drag one across the straw-covered floor, coughing a little as grains spill through a poorly tied seam. The smell is warm, earthy, with a faint sweetness, like bread crust and hay together. You tip the first sack into the mash tun, a wide wooden vat, and watch the kernels tumble in. They make a sound like rain on a hollow roof. It feels oddly comforting, though your arms are already reminding you that people in the Middle Ages didn't exactly have ergonomic workplace rules. No health and safety officer is swooping in to correct your posture. As you stir, you notice how quickly the barley dust coats everything. Your hands, your clothes, even the hairs inside your nose. It's as though the grain wants to climb inside you as much as you want to transform it. The tune creaks under the weight, and you lean your shoulder against the paddle, pushing the mixture around in heavy, clockwise strokes. One joke here. If you ever skipped the gym, no worries. Just mash barley for an hour, and you'll walk out with medieval shoulders. You wonder if knights even needed armor. They could probably deflect swords with sheer brewing muscle. There's an old fact to keep in mind. Barley was the backbone of medieval brewing. Wheat and oats were used sometimes, but barley held pride of place because it grew easily, even in poorer soils, and carried enough starch to yield a respectable amount of alcohol. For peasants, ale wasn't a luxury. It was part of the daily diet. Records show even children drank it, though usually a small ale with lower alcohol, safer than the local water. You stir and think of that. Mothers pouring mugs for toddlers, not because it was fun, but because it was survival. Now, you tilt a bucket of heated water into the mash. The steam rises quickly, curling around your face like a damp, sticky scarf. It smells faintly sweet, like porridge, but heavier, more husky. You feel the warmth soaking into your hands as you stir again, and the barley begins to swell, releasing sugars into the liquid. This is the mash in action, the bedrock of fermentation. Without it, you'd just have damp grain. Not exactly a tavern cellar's dream. There's also a quirky tidbit. Medieval brewers often relied on mash sticks, which, over time, developed their own yeast colonies. Stirring with the same stick for years could help ensure a more reliable fermentation. Some brewers even treated their mash paddles like sacred objects, handing them down like heirlooms. Imagine inheriting grandma's wooden spoon, except instead of soup, it guaranteed your beer didn't taste like vinegar. You glance at the paddle in your hands, wondering how many batches it's seen, and whether the ghosts of past brews are clinging to its cracks. You pause to mop your brow. The air in the cellar, though cool, grows heavy with the steaming mash. Condensation drips from the low ceiling. The torch on the wall sputters as the moisture creeps closer. And the rats? They seem curious, rustling in the straw near your feet. One darts out, snatches a kernel, and vanishes again, leaving only the twitch of a tail in the shadows. You sigh. Even here, you have coworkers. They're just unpaid and very, very bold. As you keep stirring, you recall how ale wasn't just for taverns. Monasteries brewed on grander scales, their monks becoming some of the most skilled brewers of the era. Brewing was both sustenance and revenue for them. The ale often sold or given as charity. But taverns like this one depended on smaller batches, where each tun had to be nursed carefully, especially when customers could turn rowdy if the ale tasted off. Historians still argue whether tavern ale was consistently drinkable, or if customers simply tolerated whatever came out of the cask, shrugging it off as part of the charm. The mash thickens as you stir, forming a slurry that bubbles lazily. You lean against the paddle, catching your breath, and let your mind wander. The floor beneath you feels uneven, patches of straw hiding dips where centuries of spilled ale have rotted the stone. You wonder how many brewers have stood in this exact spot, sweat dripping, muttering to themselves as they mashed. Maybe some cursed the barley, others prayed. Some may have whistled, though the acoustics here make even a hum sound eerie, like a choir practicing 2 rooms away. Another bucket of hot water goes in, and again the steam rises, fogging your vision. Your hair sticks to your forehead. Your arms ache. But there's a strange satisfaction in the rhythm. Scoop, pour, stir, scrape. The mash becomes more fluid, thick but glossy, and the aroma deepens, rich and sweet. You can almost smell the promise of ale forming, even though you know it's days away from drinkable. Patience is part of the craft, though patience isn't always a medieval virtue. You glance toward the stairway. Above, muffled laughter and a crash of mugs remind you of the tavern's bustle. Somewhere, a lute strums, off-key, the sound vibrating through the beams. The customers upstairs don't care about your sweat or the rats. They just want their mugs full and foaming. And you, for better or worse, are the unseen hand making that happen. Joke number 2. If customers complain, maybe you can just tell them, "Sorry, the rats were on strike today." A drip echoes again from the far wall, louder this time. You glance over, half expecting a leak. But no, it's just condensation gathering on a beam and letting go, again and again, like the cellar itself is keeping time. You stir to that rhythm, slower now, letting the paddle circle through the mash with ease. Your breath steadies, your movements smooth out. You find yourself lulled into the monotony. The cellar becomes its own world. Torchlight, steam, grain, damp stone. It's easy to imagine how brewing, though laborious, could slip into a meditative practice. Perhaps this is why so many monasteries clung to it, treating brewing as both work and devotion. Some records even describe monks singing psalms while stirring. You consider humming, but the thought of your voice bouncing around these stone walls makes you laugh quietly. Third joke. Maybe the yeast ferments better with background music, but probably not with your off-key humming. At last, you step back from the mash tun. By the time Tuesday rolls around, the cellar already feels more familiar. The damp chill clings to your bones less, or maybe you've just stopped noticing it. Today, though, you meet your most important, most temperamental coworker, yeast, or, as a medieval brewer might call it, barm. You dip a hand into yesterday's mash tun, feeling the thick, warm slurry that's been slowly cooling overnight. Now comes the gamble. Will it bubble into ale, or will it sulk and turn to sour gruel? You don't see yeast, of course. You don't have a microscope tucked into your apron pocket. Instead, you carry a wooden bucket filled with frothy residue scraped off an older batch. It's lumpy, smells faintly of bread dough mixed with cider vinegar, and wriggles with invisible life. Brewers once thought of it as a blessing, a gift from heaven, or the work of spirits. The truth, that it's colonies of microorganisms converting sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, wouldn't be uncovered for centuries. Still, you can't help but treat the bucket with reverence, lose the yeast, and you lose your livelihood. You tilt the bucket and pour it gently into the tun, watching the foam swirl across the surface. It clings stubbornly to the paddle as you stir, forming pale, glistening patches that slowly dissolve into the grainy depths. A faint fizz rises, bubbles popping against the wood. You lean closer, listening, and catch the subtle sound of fermentation beginning. A hiss, like 100 tiny sighs. Joke number 1. If your ears are ringing, don't panic. It's not ghosts. It's just yeast gossiping about you behind your back. Mainstream historical fact here. Medieval brewers often reused yeast from one brew to the next. This recycling practice kept their brewing lines alive, linking generations of ales through a single living culture. It was less precise than modern brewing, but it worked often enough. Quirky tidbit. In some places, brewers lent yeast to neighbors for baking bread. Imagine sharing not sugar or salt, but a bubbling ladle of froth carried through the village like a sacred soup. Still, nothing is guaranteed. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers could consistently control their fermentation, or whether each batch was a coin toss between drinkable ale and sour disappointment. You think of that as you stir. How many mugs upstairs are waiting? How much the tavern depends on this invisible, unpredictable magic. The yeast makes its presence known quickly. Foam gathers in clumps, sticking to the surface like marshmallows melting in hot cocoa. The smell shifts, less porridge, more tangy, almost fruity. You catch a whiff of apples and wet bread. It's oddly pleasant, though also sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. You cough, waving your hand in front of your nose. Even here, in the gloom, the yeast demands attention. You step back and let the tune rest, knowing the yeast doesn't like to be fussed over too much. Instead, you wander the cellar. The floorboards creak, moisture dripping steadily from the beams. Cobwebs shimmer faintly in the torchlight, and you notice a small clay jug wedged behind a barrel. Curious, you tug it free. Inside, you find a dried lump of something crumbly. Could it be an old yeast cake? Brewers sometimes preserved yeast by drying it on cloth or crusts of bread, then reactivating it in water. You turn the jug in your hands, amused by the idea that even long after the ale was drunk, the yeast might still be sleeping here, waiting centuries for another batch. Joke 2. You half expect it to wake up like some medieval sourdough starter, cranky and demanding barley snacks. As the tun bubbles gently, you perch on a stool and listen to the tavern upstairs. The voices grow louder today. It must be market day in the village. People gather in the common room after selling their goods, trading news as eagerly as coins. You hear laughter, shouting, and the occasional thud of a fist on a table. Brewing isn't glamorous, but it places you at the center of the social world. Without ale, the tavern would be just a cold room with benches. With it, it's the village's heartbeat. The yeast continues its work. Tiny bubbles break the surface, sending little ripples across the mash. You dip the paddle in once more, stirring gently. The foam responds, rising and falling in soft mounds. You think about how fragile this process is. One wrong turn, the temperature too cold, a contaminant creeping in, a careless spill, and the batch could spoil. Yet the yeast carries on, tireless, mysterious, unstoppable. You almost admire its stubbornness. Another thought lingers. Yeast was once tied to superstition. Some brewers whispered charms over their vats, muttering prayers to ward off evil spirits. Others believed that women brewing at home risked inviting witches if they stirred the wrong way. The line between science and magic blurred easily here, in the damp cellars and smoky kitchens. You run your hand across the paddle, half tempted to mutter a blessing yourself. Can't hurt, right? You glance back at the tun. The foam is spreading, a thin froth across the top now. The hiss grows louder, the smell sharper. Your arms ache, Your tunic is damp, and your hair smells faintly of bread gone rogue. Still, you feel a strange pride. This is progress. This is the first true step toward ale. You lean back against a barrel, eyes half closed, and imagine the yeast as tiny workers, millions of them, busily chomping through sugar, exhaling alcohol, and burping bubbles. An invisible workforce, more reliable than the rats, less demanding than the tavern customers. Joke 3. At least you don't have to feed them lunch, though they are the messiest employees you'll ever meet. The cellar hums with quiet life. The barrels seem to lean closer, listening to the bubbling. The cat reappears, tail curling as it watches the foam rise. Somewhere above, a lute strums a tune that's still painfully out of key. You smile, shoulders sagging, and let yourself sink into the rhythm of it all. The hiss, the drip, the muffled voices, the slow transformation happening before your eyes. The day winds on, and the yeast continues its work. You know you'll be back tomorrow, checking, stirring, praying it hasn't turned sour. But for now, the cellar feels warmer, friendlier, filled with quiet promise. You take one last breath, letting the tang of fermentation settle in your lungs. By Wednesday morning, your arms still ache from stirring, but there's no time to rest. The cellar waits, and today the focus is on the great tuns, those towering wooden vessels that dominate the room like slumbering giants. You approach them cautiously, torchlight flickering across their curved sides. Each tun stands taller than you, bands of iron clamped around swollen staves, and you wonder how many barrels of ale they've seen pass through their gaping mouths. They smell of damp wood, fermented sweetness, and something faintly sour clinging to the cracks. Your first job is simple in theory. Check the fermentation. You climb onto a short stool, lean over the rim of the tun, and inhale the rising fumes. It's like leaning into a loaf of bread that's been left a little too long in a humid kitchen. The yeasty aroma is sharp, tinged with fruit, but also thick enough to sting your eyes. You cough, wave a hand, and remind yourself, this is the smell of progress. The yeast has been working hard since yesterday. You stir gently, watching the foam churn and rise. Bubbles pop, sending little sprays against the sides. For a moment, you feel as if you're listening to a pot of soup that's alive. Mainstream historical fact. These tuns were vital for large-scale brewing. They allowed brewers to handle far more liquid than household pots, which meant taverns could keep up with the constant thirst of customers. In England, alehouses multiplied so quickly during the later Middle Ages that authorities sometimes tried to regulate them, worried that too many people were spending their time and their wages on drink. Yet regulation never quite kept pace with demand. Ale was too central, too necessary, too beloved. You wipe your brow and grab the stirring paddle again. The foam resists, clinging in thick clusters. Your shoulders burn as you work the paddle around. You think about medieval brewers repeating this action every day, their arms shaped by endless stirring. Joke number 1. If you were a medieval brewer, you wouldn't need a sword to impress anyone. You'd just flex your paddle arm. The cellar grows hotter with each passing moment. Steam rises. Torchlight wavers, and sweat beads along your hairline. You shift your stance, feet sliding on the straw, and nearly topple into the tun. That would be one way to flavor the ale, though probably not recommended. Instead, you catch yourself, mutter under your breath, and keep stirring. Above, you hear faint bursts of laughter. The tavern is already filling with early drinkers. Some must have started with ale before breakfast. The thought makes you shake your head. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval households brewed what they called small ale, a weaker version with lower alcohol content. It was drunk at breakfast alongside bread and porridge. Children had it too. Imagine sending a child off to chores with a mug of ale instead of orange juice. You chuckle at the idea, realizing how different the past feels, yet also how practical it was. The ale was safer than water and provided calories, even if it wouldn't make it into a modern nutrition guide. You keep stirring, the tune's contents swirling in lazy circles. The yeast froths happily, foam thickening across the surface. You lean back, satisfied for now, and set the paddle aside. The tun seems to hum faintly, though you know it's just the hiss of bubbles bursting. The sound is oddly soothing, like a bubbling brook in miniature. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers had any method for gauging the right point to move from fermentation to storage. Some think they judged by taste and smell alone. Others suspect they used improvised measures, like the thickness of foam or the sound of the tun. You glance down at the bubbling surface, trying to imagine relying on nothing but instinct and tradition. A rustling noise interrupts your thoughts. You turn to see the cat again, slinking along the edge of the cellar. Its eyes glint in the torchlight, pupils wide, tail twitching. It pauses to peer into the tun as if judging your progress. You wag a finger at it, muttering, "Not for you." The cat blinks slowly, unimpressed, and curls up on a pile of empty sacks. Joke number 2. At least one of you gets to nap through the brewing process. The hours stretch on. You move from tun to tun, checking, stirring, adding a splash of warm water here and there. Each vessel feels different. One more lively, another sluggish, another already smelling faintly sour. You wonder which batches will win favor upstairs, and which will draw complaints. Brewing is part craft, part gamble, and you're just along for the ride. The cellar holds its rhythm. Drip, hiss, stir, sigh. Your muscles ache, but you settle into the monotony. There's comfort in repetition, in knowing your role is simply to keep things moving. The yeast will do the rest. You glance at the barrels stacked along the far wall, some patched with iron plates, others leaking faint trails of liquid into the straw. Each barrel tells a story of a past brew, good, bad, or forgettable. You imagine tavern goers arguing over mugs, monks carrying casks through cloisters, peasants gulping down small ale after a day in the fields. Joke number 3 comes to mind. If beer is liquid bread, then these tuns are just medieval ovens with worse ventilation. You laugh quietly, leaning on the paddle. The yeast doesn't seem to mind the joke. By midday, the tavern above grows louder, voices rising through the floorboards. A lute strums, off-key as usual. Someone sings, though the words are lost in the muffled echoes. You pause to listen, realizing how connected the cellar is to the tavern's life. You're hidden here, unseen, yet everything upstairs depends on what bubbles quietly in the dark. You wipe your hands, stretch your back, and step away from the tun. The foam rises steadily, filling the surface. You feel strangely proud, despite the sweat and the damp. This is brewing. Messy, tiring, uncertain, but endlessly important. Without it, the tavern would be silent, the village dull, the meals dry. With it, life above brims with warmth and laughter. The torch sputters again, smoke curling in the damp air. You take one last look at the tun, hear the hiss of bubbles, and nod to yourself. The yeast is alive, the ale is on its way, and your part for today is done. You gather your tools, set them aside, and lean back against the cool stone wall. The cellar hums around you, patient and timeless. Tomorrow will bring its own tasks. For now, you let the sound of bubbling yeast and distant tavern laughter lull you into a rare moment of rest. You step into the cellar again on Thursday, and this time, the task feels more nerve-wracking than hauling sacks or stirring tune. Today, you face the water, the ingredient everyone takes for granted in modern kitchens. Yet in medieval brewing, it was both lifeline and gamble. The stone well outside provides your source, and you carry bucket after bucket down the stairs, each sloshing dangerously against the rim. The wooden handles cut into your palms. The smell of damp rope clings to you as though you've spent the morning wrestling a swamp. You set the bucket beside the mash tun, peering into its rippling surface. The water is clear enough, though you know better than to trust appearances. In this age, drinking straight from a well was risky at best. Disease and contamination lurked unseen, which is why ale became so essential. Boiled during brewing, transformed by yeast. Safer than anything you could scoop up in a mug. Mainstream historical fact. In some towns, people relied almost entirely on ale for hydration, drinking multiple pints daily, while fresh water remained suspect. You lift the bucket again, tipping its contents carefully into the tun, steam rising as the hot mash accepts it with a hiss. The cellar air grows thick with sweetness and dampness. You wipe your brow, but sweat and condensation blur together until your tunic clings like second skin. The yeast continues its quiet bubbling, grateful for the diluted sugars. You stir slowly, letting the paddle scrape the bottom. Your shoulders ache, but the rhythm grounds you. You think of all the hands before yours, countless nameless brewers whose lives circled around the same mixture of water, grain, and patience. Historians still argue whether medieval drinkers genuinely trusted ale more than water, or if it was simply habit reinforced by necessity. Whatever the answer, you can smell why. The tang of fermentation suggests safety, transformation, a promise of something more than just hydration. A rustle in the corner distracts you. You glance over and spot two rats fighting over a stray kernel. Their squeaks echo off the stone, absurdly loud for creatures so small. Joke number 1. If the rats had Yelp accounts, this cellar would have 5 stars and a wait list. You toss a pebble their way, not to harm them, but just to remind them whose tune this is. They scatter, leaving only silence and the faint drip of water from above. You return to your buckets. Each trip down the stairs feels heavier, the rope rougher, the handle sharper. Your arms shake as you lower the water in. You remind yourself that medieval brewers weren't just artisans. They were beasts of burden, laboring endlessly for each pint. Some records even suggest women, especially alewives, carried much of this physical load, hauling water from wells or rivers before dawn. You picture them, bent backs and determined faces, doing this work day after day, while customers upstairs sang, fought, and spilled half the drink across wooden tables. The tune responds with a new vigor. Foam spreads wider, bubbles bursting more frequently. The smell shifts again, sharper, livelier. You lean close, catching that mix of fruit, bread, and something almost floral. Your stomach grumbles, confused whether you're brewing breakfast or drink. Joke number 2. If you bottled this smell, you could market it as medieval ode to yeast, guaranteed to repel suitors but attract hungry monks. The cellar seems more alive with each bucket you pour. The hiss of fermentation grows constant, a soft fizz that wraps around the stone walls. The torch flickers, shadows leaping in rhythm with the bubbles. You glance upward, half expecting the ceiling to sweat under the humidity. The cat reappears, padding silently between the tons, tail flicking. It sits, watches the foam with casual authority, and yawns. Even the animals know this process is worth observing. Quirky tidbit. In some villages, brewers believed water should be drawn at certain times of day, dawn being the most favored, to ensure purity. Others whispered that water from specific springs carried lucky properties. You can't help but imagine locals arguing, one insisting the northern brook made stronger ale, another swearing by the southern well. Historians still argue whether these traditions carried any truth or were simply superstition woven into the rhythm of brewing. Either way, you glance at your buckets and wonder if you chose the right source this morning. The hours crawl by. Your body aches, but you keep moving, bucket after bucket, until the tun brims with frothy life. You step back, paddle resting at your side, and listen. The yeast sings quietly, the bubbles pop, and the cellar feels charged with invisible work. Above, faintly, you hear the tavern roar. Laughter, arguments, maybe even a fist slamming down for emphasis. Without your labor down here, that noise would falter. The ale connects these two worlds, cellar and tavern, quiet and chaos. You sink onto the stool, wiping your damp face with grain-stained hands. The bucket rests empty beside you, rope curling like a discarded snake. Joke number 3. You wonder if future archaeologists will find your fingerprints on these paddles and conclude you were some kind of yeast whisperer. If only they knew the truth. You're just tired and slightly damp, hoping the rats don't unionize. The day's task is finished. The tune bubbles steadily, water and barley joined into something new. You stretch your stiff arms, hearing a satisfying crack, and glance around the cellar. Shadows sway gently. The cat dozes. The barrels hum their quiet secrets. You know tomorrow will bring deliveries, more hauling, more sweat. But for now, you let the sound of fermentation fill the silence, a reminder that even in the dampest, darkest corners, something is always alive, always transforming. By Friday morning, the cellar feels less like a workplace and more like a second skin. The air has soaked into your clothes, your hair, even your fingernails. You smell faintly of malt, no matter how often you wipe your hands. Today, though, you hardly stay in the cellar at all. Friday is delivery day, and that means heaving barrels up the stairs and rolling them across the tavern floor to wherever they're needed. Your arms already protest at the thought. You start with the smallest cask, hoping to ease into the task, but even that proves heavier than it looks. The wood creaks when you push, and your shoulders strain as you wedge your back against it. Slowly, carefully, you rock it free from the pile. The straw beneath crunches, scattering husks that cling to your tunic. With a grunt, you tip the cask onto its side and begin the long roll toward the stairs. Each turn thumps, echoing through the cellar like a muffled drumbeat. You mutter under your breath that brewing ale should count as full-body exercise. Joke number 1, forget medieval gyms. Just sign up for the barrel boot camp down at your local tavern. At the foot of the stairs, you pause. The climb looms ahead, each step slick with wear. You brace yourself, heave, and shove the barrel upward. The wood scrapes against the stone. Your breath comes in sharp bursts and your arms tremble. Step by step, you climb, pushing with every ounce of strength you have left. The torchlight fades as daylight spills from the tavern above, warm and golden compared to the cellar's gloom. At last, you emerge into the main room, chest heaving, sweat rolling, and deposit the barrel near the wall with a groan of victory. The tavern bursts with life around you. Friday means market day, and villagers stream in after trading, arms laden with coins or leftover produce. You hear gossip flying faster than the mugs. Who sold the fattest goose? Who cheated on weights? Who quarreled over land? The air smells of roasted meat, hay trodden in from the street, and above all, ale. The noise is a mix of laughter, arguing, and the occasional squeal as someone drops a mug. Mainstream historical fact. Taverns like this one weren't just drinking halls. They served as hubs of community life. Contracts were signed here, marriages arranged, disputes settled, and news spread. Some towns even regulated tavern hours because too many workers lingered over mugs instead of showing up for labor in the fields. Historians still argue whether taverns were primarily spaces of relaxation or if they were vital extensions of business and politics. Either way, you see firsthand how central this place is. You roll another barrel up, this one heavier, and nearly lose it on the 5th step. It slams back, bouncing against your shin, and you hiss in pain. You catch it just in time, leaning your weight to steady it. You mutter a prayer of thanks to whichever saint might protect brewers from broken bones. Joke number 2. You imagine the paperwork involved if OSHA had to inspect medieval taverns. Stairs, slippery. Barrels, lethal. Lighting, candle-powered. Outcome, denied. By midday, the tavern buzzes at full tilt. Merchants laugh raucously in one corner, coins clinking as they gamble. Farmers shout greetings, their muddy boots scattering dirt across the floor. In the center, a minstrel strums a lute that sounds more like a goose with a sore throat than an instrument. Patrons clap anyway, mugs raised high. You pass by with your barrel, unnoticed. Just another piece of furniture to them. You're the hidden hand, the one ensuring their laughter flows as freely as the ale in their cups. Quirky tidbit. Some taverns brewed right on the premises, while others brought in casks from larger breweries. In both cases, delivery was grueling. Records describe brewers hiring porters, whose entire job was carrying barrels from cellars to tavern halls. day after day. You feel a new kinship with those long-forgotten laborers, knowing the strain in their shoulders, the sting in their palms. Each barrel you roll is more than wood and liquid. It's the fuel of the village's social life. As you pause for breath, you listen to the conversation swirling around you. A woman complains about the tax collector's visit. A man boasts of catching a fox with his bare hands, though the skeptical looks suggest exaggeration. At another table, two farmers argue fiercely over the merits of rye versus barley, their voices rising until one slams his mug down. The ale sloshes, foam spraying, and the room erupts in laughter. Historians still argue whether these disputes in taverns ever escalated into real violence, or if most ended in spilled ale and sheepish apologies. Watching these men, you suspect the latter. You fetch yet another barrel, rolling it with slow determination. Your back aches, your palms blister, but you fall into rhythm. Roll, shove, climb, deliver. The tavern keeper nods approvingly each time you deposit another cask, already tapping into one before you've brought the next. Customers cheer as the froth spills, mugs clinking in gratitude for your unseen labor. Joke number 3. You wonder if anyone upstairs has ever toasted the brewer. Probably not. They toast saints, kings, even the village goat, but never the sweaty figure hauling barrels up from the cellar. The afternoon light shifts, shadows stretching across the tavern floor. You've delivered enough barrels to keep the room stocked until evening. You slump against the wall, chest heaving, and take in the scene. The minstrel's tune grows louder, the dice clatter, and the voices swell. This is what your work sustains: the laughter, the gossip, the messy weave of community life. Without the barrels, there would be silence. Without the ale, there would be no glue binding these villagers together. At last, you retreat back to the cellar. The quiet greets you like an old friend. The air is cooler here, the torchlight softer. The tun bubbles still, yeast hard at work. You sink onto your stool, sore, but oddly content. The tavern roars above, but down here, the slow rhythm of brewing continues undisturbed. You stretch your arms, feeling the ache spread, and smile faintly. Delivery day is brutal, but it proves your place in the cycle. Unseen, but essential. As the cellar hums quietly, you let your thoughts drift. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. More stirring, more watching, more hauling. But for now, you've earned this moment of rest. The yeast bubbles softly, the barrels stand in neat rows, and your muscles hum with exhaustion. Saturday morning greets you with a peculiar stillness. The tavern above hasn't quite woken yet, though you can already hear faint clinks of mugs being stacked, and the barkeep's heavy steps across the floorboards. Down here in the cellar, however, you're not alone. You've begun to notice your fellow residents, creatures who neither drink ale nor pay for it, yet treat the place like their ancestral hall. The shadows shift in the corners, cobwebs sway faintly, and the straw rustles with tiny movements. The first to greet you is, as always, the cellar's unofficial lord, the cat. Sleek, mottled fur, eyes glinting green in the torchlight. It strolls in without ceremony, tail upright, as if you've been tolerated as a guest in its domain. You've started leaving it scraps now and then, though whether it appreciates your offerings or simply accepts them as tribute remains unclear. It leaps effortlessly onto the rim of a barrel, curls into a ball, and begins to watch with half-closed eyes. You envy its confidence. Not far behind comes the familiar scuttling of mice. They dart through holes in the stonework, quick shadows skimming the floor. You catch sight of one, bold enough to pause near a dropped kernel, nibbling furiously before vanishing again. Mainstream historical fact. Granaries, breweries, and tavern cellars were infamous havens for rodents. Written accounts from the Middle Ages describe constant battles between brewers and pests, with traps, cats, and sheer persistence as the only defenses. You sigh, realizing you're part of a long tradition of shaking your fist at small creatures that couldn't care less. You set about your morning tasks, checking the tun, skimming off excess foam, stirring gently to keep fermentation balanced. The smell rises strong, a blend of sweet bread and tart fruit, sharper than yesterday. The yeast is thriving, froth clinging to your paddle as though it doesn't want to let go. You scrape it free, leaning your shoulder against the wood. The hiss of bubbles feels louder in the early quiet, as though the yeast wants to remind you that it is the true master here. Joke number 1. You wonder if yeast and cats ever compared notes on who owned the cellar. A drip echoes again, steady as ever from the beams above. You follow the sound, torch in hand, and discover another companion, a cluster of spiders. Their webs glisten with droplets, threads stretched across a corner like tiny harp strings. One spider hangs motionless, patient, waiting for the unlucky gnat that dares wander too far. You shiver slightly, not from fear, but from the eerie beauty of it. Quirky tidbit. Some medieval households actually welcomed spiders, believing their webs brought good luck and even protected against illness. You glance at the cluster and decide perhaps they're better roommates than the mice. The cellar feels alive in a way books rarely capture. Every sound matters. The scrape of your paddle, the twitch of straw under tiny paws, the faint mew of the cat as it shifts position. Above, muffled laughter begins again. But down here, you're part of a smaller, stranger community. Historians still argue whether medieval brewers treated these creatures as nuisances to be eradicated, or as inevitable companions in an environment that couldn't be fully controlled. Looking at the cat sprawled across a barrel, you'd argue it was a bit of both. You pause to rest on your stool, rubbing your aching arms. The torch flickers, smoke curling into the damp air. The cat yawns, showing sharp teeth, then stretches languidly as if mocking your fatigue. You mutter something about unfair divisions of labor. Joke number 2. Maybe the tavern should start charging the cat rent. It's here more than the customers are. A sudden crash from upstairs makes the cat's ears twitch. You freeze, listening. But it's only the sound of a bench being overturned, followed by hearty laughter. Probably another round of dice gone wrong. You shake your head and return to your paddle, stirring slowly, letting the froth shift and settle. Your movements sync with the rhythm of the cellar. Drip, hiss, scrape, sigh. It's oddly comforting, a steady heartbeat beneath the chaos above. As you stir, your thoughts drift to how people once saw animals in these spaces. Cats weren't just pets. They were working creatures, valued for their hunting skills. Mice were despised, but tolerated. When extermination proved impossible, even spiders had their place. The cellar, in its way, represents a medieval balance. Humans, yeast, and animals coexisting in the shadows, each shaping the space. You chuckle softly, imagining a council of cellar residents negotiating over rent and rations. By midday, the tavern above grows louder, footsteps pounding as more customers arrive. The air shakes faintly with the rumble of voices. You rest the paddle against the tun, wipe your hands on your grain-dusted tunic, and glance at the cat again. It has fallen asleep, purring softly, tail twitching. The spiders remain vigilant, webs swaying. The mice scurry unseen. And you're just another creature in the cellar, doing your part in this curious ecosystem. Joke number 3. If taverns had mascots, this one would be a cat holding a mug, with mice dancing underneath and yeast bubbling in the background. You grin at the thought, even as you stretch your sore back and sigh. The work continues, checking casks, shifting smaller barrels, brushing away excess foam. But the cellar feels less lonely now. Its creatures remind you that brewing isn't just human effort. It's nature in all its forms, invited or not. The yeast bubbles, the mice nibble, the cat purrs, the spiders weave. Together, you sustain the tavern above, though none of you will ever get a thank you toast. As the afternoon light fades, you light another torch, letting its glow push back the shadows. The creatures retreat slightly, but you know they're still there, watching, waiting. You return to your stool, letting the warmth seep into your bones. The tune hisses softly, alive and busy. The cat shifts, curling tighter. The cellar sighs with its strange harmony. You realize then that this underworld of the tavern isn't just a workplace. It's a living, breathing community of odd companions, silent, watchful, endlessly persistent. And in that realization, you feel a peculiar comfort. The cellar may never be glamorous, but it will never be empty either. By Sunday evening, you've grown used to the cellar's gloom. But tonight, you're drawn to the racket upstairs. The tavern has filled earlier than usual, and the sound pours through the beams as if the ceiling itself might collapse under the weight of all that noise. Shouts, claps, mugs slamming. It's as though the entire village has decided to gather. You wipe your hands, push open the trap door, and climb into the tavern hall. The change is immediate. Warmth envelops you, carrying smells of roasted meat, sweat, damp wool, and the unmistakable tang of ale. Candles flicker along the tables, their light catching the sheen of spilled drink and greasy trenchers. The fire crackles in the hearth, logs spitting sparks, while the spit turns lazily, dripping fat into the flames. The crowd is rowdy, voices competing for dominance. Somewhere in the back corner, a lute begins a tune. Badly. The notes stumble over one another, strings twanging with heroic determination but little accuracy. Joke number 1. You realize even the yeast downstairs could keep better rhythm. You edge past the crowd, barrel under one arm, and glance around. Farmers with mud still clinging to their boots lean shoulder to shoulder, trading gossip. Merchants in brighter tunics flash coins as they boast about market sales. A pair of travelers, judging by the road dust on their cloaks, sit hunched over mugs, heads close as though sharing secrets. Children dart between benches, earning half-hearted scolds when they spill someone's drink. The tavern is chaos, yet it pulses with energy that feels strangely alive. Mainstream historical fact. Taverns like this became essential spaces in medieval towns. They weren't just about drink. They provided shelter for travelers, space for village meetings, and stages for musicians. Records from cities like London show taverns doubling as informal courts, where disputes were argued over mugs of ale. Some authorities even banned music after certain hours, fearing that drunken singing would tip into riots. Historians still argue whether taverns brought communities closer together or simply distracted workers from their obligations. Watching tonight's crowd, you'd say it's both. The lute player grows louder, strumming with enthusiasm that far outpaces talent. A few customers cheer, mugs raised high, while others groan. You pause by the wall, barrel resting at your feet, and watch as one man attempts to sing along. He's off-key, loud enough to drown out the lute, and so confident that nobody dares correct him. His neighbors clap in time, stomping their boots until the whole tavern shakes. You catch yourself laughing, though you quickly smother the sound, worried you'll draw attention to yourself. The innkeeper calls, waving for your barrel. You roll it across the floor, weaving between tables. The crowd parts reluctantly, some patrons glaring as their dice games scatter. You mutter an apology, though nobody listens. The barrel thuds into place by the tap, and the innkeeper wastes no time driving in the spigot. Foam gushes, mugs thrust forward, and the shouting crescendos. You step back, wiping your grain-stained hands on your tunic, and observe. The ale you tended in the cellar now fills cups, sliding down throats, fueling laughter and arguments alike. Quirky tidbit. In some taverns, musicians were paid not with coins, but with food and ale. A good night's performance might earn a loaf of bread, a bowl of stew, and enough drink to stagger home. Looking at tonight's lute player, you wonder whether his payment might be less than that if customers vote with their mugs. Joke number 2. You suspect the cat in the cellar could strum the lute just as well if given the chance. The noise grows heavier, pressing against you like a storm. Dice clatter, voices shout over each other, and a scuffle breaks out near the door. 2 men argue furiously about the fairness of a wager, fists already raised. A woman leaps between them, slapping both on the shoulder and scolding them like children. The crowd roars with laughter. The tension diffused, though mugs spill in the process. Foam sprays across the table, dripping onto the floorboards. You shake your head, amused and weary all at once. Historians still argue whether taverns were genuine cultural melting pots or just noisy halls of indulgence. Evidence suggests both. Clergy wrote endless sermons condemning excessive drinking, yet monasteries themselves brewed on vast scales. Town officials fined taverns for disorderly conduct, yet spent evenings there after council meetings watching tonight's contradictions unfold. You realize no decree could ever banish taverns. They were too deeply woven into the rhythms of daily life. You linger near the hearth, soaking in the warmth. The firelight glows against the smoky ceiling, casting shadows that sway with each burst of laughter. Someone shouts for another song, and the lute begins again, joined by claps, stomps, and an enthusiastic drum improvised on the tabletop. The beat is infectious, clumsy but irresistible. Even you find your foot tapping, despite yourself. Joke number 3. Perhaps yeast bubbles better if it hears live music, though this performance might sour the batch entirely. The evening drags on, a blur of noise and movement. You carry smaller casks, refill mugs, dodge splashes of foam. Every step feels like weaving through a storm. Yet beneath the chaos, you sense the tavern's heartbeat. Steady, insistent, alive. The cellar may sustain it, but up here, the tavern breathes. As the night wanes, some patrons stagger out, cloaks pulled tight, laughter trailing behind them into the dark street. Others collapse on benches, heads pillowed on arms, mugs still clutched loosely. The lute grows quieter, strums slowing, until the player finally slumps in defeat. The innkeeper wipes sweat from his brow, already planning tomorrow's tasks. You roll one last empty barrel aside, arms aching, and glance toward the trap door. The cellar calls you back, promising quiet after the din. You descend again, torchlight greeting you like an old friend. The yeast still bubbles, steady and patient, untouched by the chaos above. You breathe deeply, letting the damp coolness wash over you, grateful for the silence. The tavern's roar has faded to a distant hum, muffled through the beams. Down here, you are alone again, with the yeast, the cat, the spiders, and the steady drip of water. You sink onto your stool, close your eyes, and let exhaustion settle across your shoulders. Upstairs, ale fuels song and quarrel. Down here, it ferments in peace, a reminder that the loudest nights depend on the quietest labor. Monday returns, and with it comes one of the cellar's stranger puzzles. You sit on your stool, paddle resting at your side, and stare at the frothy tun as though it might explain itself. The ale bubbles steadily, yeast hard at work, but a question nags at you. Is this ale, or is it beer? The tavern customers use the words interchangeably, but you've heard enough chatter to know the distinction matters, or at least it once did. You take a breath, sniff the tangy air, and feel the need to puzzle it out. Mainstream historical fact. In early medieval England, the word ale referred to a drink made without hops, while beer became the term once hops entered the recipe, a practice arriving from continental Europe around the late Middle Ages. The two drinks overlapped for centuries, with ale seen as the older, traditional staple, and beer as the newer, sometimes foreign innovation. You stir the tun thoughtfully, wondering which camp your bubbling brew belongs to. There are no hops here, just barley, water, and yeast. By the stricter definition, you're making ale. But the line is blurrier than it sounds. Historians still argue whether the average drinker truly noticed the difference, or if the debate mattered more to guilds and tax collectors than to thirsty peasants. Some records suggest people swore loyalty to good ale, while others eagerly embraced hopped beer for its longer shelf life. You glance at the foaming surface, amused that centuries later, scholars still can't decide whether medieval customers cared. Maybe they just wanted something wet, filling, and slightly numbing after a day in the fields. You lean closer, catching the scent of the froth. It's sharp, tangy, slightly fruity. Without hops, there's no bitterness to balance the sweetness. The yeast has done its work, but the result will taste different from what most modern palates expect. Quirky tidbit. Before hops became common, brewers often flavored ale with a mixture called groot, a blend of herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, and rosemary. Some believed these herbs carried not just flavor, but magical properties, protection from illness, or even, depending on the mix, mild hallucinogenic effects. You imagine customers stumbling home, not just tipsy, but convinced they'd seen fairies dancing by the hedgerows. Joke number 1. You wonder if the real reason medieval folks saw witches flying on broomsticks was less about sorcery and more about a few mugs of Groot-flavored ale. The innkeeper stomps into the cellar, his boots scattering straw, and claps you on the shoulder. "How's it coming?" he asks, though he doesn't really wait for an answer. He peers into the tun, nods approvingly at the froth, and grins. Good ale makes good coin. That's all that matters. He heads back upstairs, leaving you with the hiss of bubbles and the faint scrape of his boots overhead. You shake your head. To him, the debate is pointless. Ale, beer, wine, cider. If it fills mugs and empties purses, the tavern thrives. Still, you find yourself lost in thought as you stir again, paddle scraping gently. The foam shifts, swirls, spreads like clouds across the surface. You think of guilds forming in cities, arguing over definitions, setting standards to control trade. alewives brewing at home, sometimes praised, sometimes accused of dishonesty. Merchants importing hopped beer from Flanders, touting its superiority, while locals scoffed that it tasted foreign. Historians still argue whether hops were immediately loved or bitterly resisted. You suspect the truth lies in both. Some tongues welcomed the bite, others clung to the sweetness of tradition. You pause, leaning the paddle against the rim, and imagine customers upstairs. Do they even notice? Or do they drink whatever's poured, so long as the mugs keep coming? A farmer with sore shoulders, a merchant flush with coin, a traveler seeking warmth. None of them likely ask whether the drink is technically ale or beer. They laugh, they argue, they sing badly to lute music. They live, and the brew, whatever name it takes, is part of that life. The cat appears again, leaping lightly onto a barrel and curling into a loaf. Its tail flicks once, twice, before settling. You glance at it, amused. Ale or beer? You ask aloud. The cat blinks slowly, clearly uninterested. Joke number 2. You decide the cat's silence proves it's a loyal ale traditionalist. The torch sputters, smoke curling into the damp air. You scrape foam from the paddle, watching it drip back into the tun. The hiss continues, steady, insistent. You think of how definitions shape history, how something as simple as a word could carry weight, dividing towns, shaping trade, even fueling legal disputes. Yet here, in the quiet cellar, it feels faintly absurd. You stir, you sweat, you ache, and in the end, people drink. The yeast doesn't care what you call it. Neither does the cat. You settle onto your stool, letting the tun bubble without interference. Your back aches, your arms feel heavy, but your mind lingers on the distinction. You picture guild officials scribbling rules, monks blessing their hopped brews, merchants boasting of longer shelf lives. You imagine peasants rolling their eyes, slamming down mugs, and demanding another round. Historians still argue whether ale truly vanished under beer's rise, or whether it quietly lingered, brewed in kitchens and taverns long after official records stopped caring. The thought comforts you. Tradition and innovation coexisting, stubborn as yeast in a barrel. Joke number 3. You chuckle, imagining a medieval debate club where one side shouts ale and the other beer, while the audience just yells more. The cellar quiets again as the day wanes. The tun bubbles steadily. Yeast singing its invisible chorus. You lean your head back against the cool stone wall, eyes half closing. The torch flickers, shadows swaying across barrels, stacked like silent judges. You breathe in the mingled scent of grain, foam, and damp stone. Whatever the word, ale or beer, it is alive. It is transforming, and it is part of the tavern's heartbeat. As evening settles, you rise once more, paddle in hand, and give the tun a final stir. Foam swirls, bubbles burst, and the hiss continues. You wipe your hands, stretch your sore arms, and glance at the cat again. It yawns unimpressed. You smile faintly. Tomorrow will bring new flavors, new tasks, perhaps even new arguments upstairs. But tonight, you leave. Tuesday begins with the smell of roasting meat drifting through the cellar beams. Your stomach growls before you've even lit the torch. It's feast day, which means the tavern will serve more than bread, stew, or porridge. Today, there will be pies, fish, and perhaps even rare spices if the merchants were generous at the market. And of course, every dish will be paired with ale. You rub your tired shoulders, knowing the feast will test your work more than any guild inspector ever could. You begin by checking the casks prepared for the evening. Foam still clings to the rims. The wooden staves cool under your hands. You tip a ladle into one, sniffing cautiously. The aroma is yeasty, bready, a little sharp. It promises flavor that will either complement or clash with whatever comes out of the kitchen. Mainstream historical fact: medieval meals weren't organized into courses as modern diners expect. Instead, multiple dishes arrived together, often strange combinations by modern standards. Ale was the constant companion, used to wash down eel pie, spiced goose, or dense rye bread. You stir a cask thoughtfully, already imagining the flavors. By midday, the tavern above begins its transformation. The scrape of benches, the slam of platters, the bark of the innkeeper's voice as he orders everyone about. You haul another cask upstairs, sweat dripping down your back as you roll it across the floor. The hall fills with noise and smells. Pies steaming, fish sizzling in pans, vegetables boiled until they surrender into mush. Quirky tidbit: records mention eel pie as a delicacy, though to modern tastes, it sounds less like a treat and more like a dare. You peer at the steaming dish carried past and wonder how much ale it will take to make that palatable. The first customers arrive, cloaks damp from the drizzle outside. They crowd around tables, already calling for mugs. The innkeeper nods at you, and you hurry to tap the cask. Foam spurts, mugs thrust forward, and the evening's rhythm begins. The feast isn't just about food. It's about spectacle, noise, and endless drink. Historians still argue whether tavern feasts blurred the line between celebration and survival. Were they true indulgence, or simply a rare break from the monotonous grind of bread and porridge? Watching tonight's crowd, you suspect both. The platters arrive in waves. First bread, dense and dark, more brick than loaf. Then pies, their crusts flaking into the air as knives pierce through. Steam spills, releasing scents of fish, onion, and unfamiliar herbs. Then trenchers of meat, dripping fat onto stale bread beneath. The ale flows alongside, mugs never empty for long. You refill cask after cask, the spigot spraying foam across your arms. Joke number 1. You imagine starting a cookbook called Pairing Ale with Questionable Foods. Chapter 1. Eel pie, best swallowed quickly with a strong gulp. Chapter 2. Mystery stew, ideally consumed after your third mug, when your judgment is already compromised. You pause long enough to steal a bite of bread. It's heavy, coarse, filling. You wash it down with a sip from your ladle, and the flavors merge. Grain on grain, hearty and sustaining, if not exactly refined. You imagine peasants savoring moments like this, when food and drink together made them feel briefly wealthy. For the tavern's better-off customers, the feast is a chance to flaunt coin, to order more, to laugh louder. But for you, it's proof that the cellar's labor sustains more than thirst. It feeds pride, appetite, and a sense of community. The noise swells. Someone sings, badly. Someone else slams a mug in rhythm, turning the hall into an impromptu choir of stomps, claps, and off-key voices. You roll your eyes, but a smile creeps onto your face anyway. Above the racket, you hear one man declare that eel pie is fit for kings, while another retorts that it tastes like ditch water. The argument ends in laughter, mugs clinking, ale sloshing onto the table. Quirky tidbit number 2. Spices like cinnamon, saffron, or ginger occasionally appeared in medieval feasts, brought by long trade routes. They were luxuries, symbols of wealth. Tonight, you spot a merchant sprinkling something suspiciously golden over his dish, drawing envious glances. You can't smell it over the haze of roasted onions, but you know it marks him as richer than most of the room. Historians still argue whether these displays were genuine appreciation of flavor or simply status symbols disguised as seasoning. The cat slips upstairs at some point, padding between benches, tail twitching as it scavenges scraps. Children giggle, tossing bones its way, while mothers scold half-heartedly. You watch it weave through the chaos, unbothered, perfectly at home. Joke number 2. You decide the cat must be the true tavern owner, paid nightly in leftovers, worshipped in scratches behind the ears. The feast continues, each dish stranger than the last. A tray of boiled turnips vanishes faster than the goose, proving hunger trumps preference. Mugs clang, foam spills, laughter booms. You fetch more casks, arms trembling with fatigue. Yet even as you ache, you find energy in the crowd's joy. The tavern lives fully tonight, a living organism fueled by your cellared labor. Late into the evening, arguments break out. 2 farmers debate whose field grows better barley, pounding the table so hard the dice scatter. A group of merchants brag about profits, voices rising until the innkeeper barks them down. A traveler tells a tale of wolves on the road, so dramatic that half the children gasp, though the adults roll their eyes. Through it all, ale smooths the edges, turning tempers into laughter. Joke number 3. You wonder if ale should be rebranded as liquid mediator, guaranteed to turn disputes into songs if consumed in the right amount. By the time the feast winds down, the floor is sticky with spills, the air thick with smoke and sweat. Patrons slump on benches, bellies full, mugs abandoned. The minstrel strums one last half-hearted chord before giving up entirely. You roll the last empty cask aside, wipe your brow, and glance toward the trap door. The cellar waits, quieter, calmer, smelling of yeast instead of eel pie. You descend again, torch in hand. The bubbling tun greets you, steady as ever, untouched by the chaos above. You breathe deeply, grateful for the quiet. The cellar creatures stir. The cat returns, licking grease from its whiskers. The spiders glisten in torchlight. The mice scurry unseen. The Wednesday creeps in damp and cold, the kind of morning when the cellar feels more like a cavern than a workspace. Your breath clouds faintly as you step down the stairs, torch in hand, and the smell of damp wood rises stronger than usual. Today's task isn't glamorous, but it's one of the most critical. Tending to the barrels. They leak. They warp. They demand attention like cranky children. Without them, all the ale in the world would have nowhere to rest. You start with the nearest cask, crouching low to run your fingers along the iron hoops. The wood is cool, slick with condensation. A faint drip darkens the straw beneath. You sigh, shaking your head. Another leak. You drag the barrel away from the wall, muscles straining, and tilt it slightly to inspect. Sure enough, one stave has separated just enough to weep. Mainstream historical fact. Medieval barrels weren't just storage. They were technological marvels. Coopering, the craft of barrel making, required immense skill. A properly made barrel could hold liquid without glue or nails, sealed only by pressure, shape, and swelling wood. You tap the hoop with your mallet, testing its strength. The sound rings dull. You grab a wedge and hammer it gently, tightening the band. Sparks of noise echo through the cellar, startling the cat, who leaps off a sack with an indignant hiss. You mutter an apology, though the cat ignores you and slinks away. The barrel groans, then settles. Another hammer, Another adjustment, and the leak slows to a stop. You wipe your damp fingers against your tunic, satisfied. Quirky tidbit. Coopers sometimes left secret marks on their barrels, little symbols carved into the wood, half signature, half blessing. Some marks survive on archaeological finds, proof that barrel makers treated their work as art as much as craft. You run your hand along the cask's surface, half expecting to find a hidden symbol, though all you feel is rough wood and sticky residue. Still, the thought lingers. Some forgotten cooper's pride etched in the grain. Historians still argue whether barrels truly revolutionized trade, or simply improved upon older storage methods like amphorae. Some say barrels enabled wider beer and wine distribution, while others argue clay jars and leather skins had long sufficed. Here in the cellar, though, the argument feels abstract. Barrels are your reality, groaning, leaking, demanding. You smack the hoop again with the mallet and decide the revolution is in your aching arms. Joke number 1. You wonder if the barrels leak out of malice, like they resent being trapped and long to return to trees. You move on to the next cask. This one isn't leaking, but the spigot wobbles. You tighten it carefully, muttering curses when foam spurts across your tunic. The yeast has clearly been busy. The barrel seems eager to escape. You plug it quickly, wipe the sticky froth from your arms, and laugh quietly. Patience, you whisper, as though the ale might listen. The torch flickers in agreement. By mid-morning, the cellar is filled with the rhythmic sound of hammering and scraping. You wedge staves tighter, patch cracks with softened reeds, and rub beeswax along seams. The smell of warm wax mixes with yeast and damp wood until your nose can hardly distinguish them. The mice scurry away from the noise, but the spiders remain, unmoved in their corners. The cat eventually returns, perching high on a barrel to watch your efforts. You swear it smirks every time a hoop resists your hammer. Joke number 2. You imagine the cat as a master cooper, judging your technique with unimpressed eyes. Your angles are off, its glare seems to say. As you work, your mind drifts. Barrels aren't just storage, they shape taste. Ale resting in wood picks up flavors, subtle hints of oak or resin, mingling with yeast's tang. Modern palates might prize stainless steel for purity, but here, every cask carries its own voice. You wonder if customers upstairs can taste the difference between one barrel and the next, or if they simply drink and laugh, oblivious to the nuances sweating out of the staves. You pause for a drink of water, not ale, not yet, and glance around. The torchlight reveals rows of barrels leaning like weary giants, some patched, some pristine, some scarred by decades of use. You feel a strange kinship with them, all held together by pressure and persistence. Historians still argue whether medieval taverns could consistently maintain their barrels, or if leaks and spoilage were simply expected losses. Judging by your morning so far, you'd wager it was the latter. By noon, your back aches, your arms buzz with fatigue, and your ears ring from hammering. You slump onto your stool, mallet across your lap, and listen to the cellar breathe. Drips, hisses, faint creaks. It feels alive, restless, as though the barrels murmur among themselves about your efforts. You chuckle softly. Joke number 3. If barrels could talk, they'd probably complain about you more than you complain about them. The innkeeper stomps down, glances at the patched casks, and nods. Good work, he mutters, already distracted by the ledger he carries. He counts, scribbles, frowns, then leaves again, boots echoing up the stairs. You roll your eyes. Praise is rare. Coin rarer. Still, the work matters. The tavern thrives on barrels as much as on laughter. You return to your tasks, tightening one last hoop, smearing wax into one last seam. The torch sputters, smoke curling into the damp air. Your tunic clings with sweat and ale residue. Your hands are raw from hammering, but the cellar feels steadier now. The leaks have slowed, the seams are tighter, the barrels sigh less in their corners. As the day wanes, you lean back, stretching sore muscles, and let your gaze drift across the rows. The patched barrels gleam faintly in the torchlight, proud in their resilience. The yeast bubbles on, indifferent to your repairs, but you feel a quiet satisfaction. You've given the ale safe vessels to rest in, safe vessels to travel in, safe vessels to be poured upstairs, where songs and quarrels never end. The cat yawns, curls tighter on its perch. The spiders sway gently in their webs. The mice remain hidden, waiting for quiet. And you, weary but content, rest your mallet across your knees and close your eyes. The cellar hums softly. Thursday begins not with silence, but with shouting. Even from the cellar you can hear it. The unmistakable sound of voices raised in anger, mugs slamming, benches scraping. You sigh, setting down your paddle. The tavern above has erupted early today, and that can only mean one thing: disputes. You climb halfway up the stairs, stopping at the trap door, listening. The noise swells, muffled, but clear enough to paint a picture. Two farmers, perhaps, or a merchant and a customer. Arguments in taverns are as old as taverns themselves, and the ale you tend below fuels them as much as it soothes them. You descend again, torch flickering against damp stone, and resume your tasks. The tune bubbles steadily, foam clinging to the rim. Yet even as you stir, the shouting above filters down. The voices grow sharper, punctuated by bursts of laughter, as though the crowd is enjoying the show. Mainstream historical fact: taverns were notorious sites of dispute. Records mention arguments over land boundaries, unpaid debts, even insults shouted across mugs. Some taverns doubled as unofficial courts, where disputes were settled with drink as much as with law. You stir slowly, imagining how many of those disputes were resolved simply because the ale ran out. The noise continues. A bench screeches across the floorboards. Something heavy thuds, perhaps a fist, perhaps a man falling. You glance upward, half expecting dust to drift down from the rafters. The cat flicks its ears, unimpressed, and stretches across a barrel. You shake your head. For the cat, tavern quarrels are just background music. Quirky tidbit: some medieval towns imposed fines on taverns when fights broke out, blaming the innkeeper for failing to keep order. In some cases, the penalty was paid in barrels of ale, handed over to the local lord or council. You chuckle softly, imagining the councilors pretending to frown while eagerly accepting their fine. And historians still argue whether tavern disputes reflected deep social tensions or were simply drunken theatrics. Judging by the noise tonight, you'd say both. Joke number 1. You decide taverns were the original reality shows, complete with yelling, dramatic exits, and audiences cheering for their favorite contestants. By midday, the shouting subsides into a dull roar. The cellar grows quieter again, the tun hissing gently, the drip from the beams steady. You stir slowly, grateful for the turn of rhythm. Yet your mind lingers on the chaos above. Every mug poured carries more than ale. It carries the potential for argument, laughter, reconciliation, or rage. Your work fuels it all, for better or worse. The innkeeper stomps down the stairs not long after, face red, hands on hips. He mutters curses about fools who can't hold their drink, then checks the barrels, tapping each with a practiced ear. He nods at your repairs from yesterday, mutters a gruff, "Good," and heads back upstairs. His boots thunder, the trap door slams, and the shouting resumes faintly overhead. You return to your stool, paddle resting across your knees, and sigh. The cellar may be quiet, but you're never truly apart from the noise above. You pause to listen. Another burst of laughter, another shouted insult. Someone starts singing, badly, then stops when the crowd groans. You grin faintly. Joke number 2. You wonder if medieval disputes would have ended faster if everyone had been forced to sing their arguments in lute-accompanied verse. The day drags on. You shift smaller casks, scrape foam from the tun, patch another seam. Yet every task feels tied to the tavern's noise. You imagine the disputes upstairs, arguments over taxes, over whose ox wandered where, over who cheated at dice. Sometimes they must have ended in fists, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in slurred apologies. Historians still argue whether taverns spread disorder or built community. Watching from the cellar, you suspect the answer is both, tangled together like cobwebs in the rafters. By late afternoon, the cellar grows darker, shadows stretching long. The torch sputters, smoke curling into the damp air. The cat hops down, tail flicking, and pads toward the stairs as though to witness the drama above. You shake your head. Curiosity, it seems, isn't only human. You lean back against a barrel, paddle across your lap, and let the cellar's steady hum soothe you. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some disputes in taverns became legendary, retold for years afterward, exaggerated until they resembled epic sagas. A minor argument over a chicken might grow into a tale of betrayal, duels, and scandal. You smile faintly, imagining the farmers upstairs one day immortalized in song as the men who fought over barley. And joke number 3. You picture bards in the future chanting about spilled ale as if it were a battle lost at sea. As night falls, the shouting quiets. The tavern hums with softer voices, the edge dulled by drink. You climb the stairs again, crack the trap door, and peek. The scene is as expected. Patrons slumped on benches, mugs half empty. A few stubborn voices still grumbling, but too tired to fight. The innkeeper wipes tables with a rag, glaring at anyone who looks ready to start trouble again. The lute player strums softly, the notes wobbly but soothing. You retreat to the cellar, torch casting faint halos on the damp walls. The tune bubbles, barrels creak, mice scurry through straw. The air feels cooler now, calmer. You sink onto your stool, let your eyes drift closed, and listen. The yeast hisses steadily, indifferent to arguments, reconciliations, or fines. You breathe deeply, letting the quiet seep into your bones. Tomorrow will bring new tasks, new quarrels, new laughter, but tonight you rest, content in the knowledge that even disputes are part of the tavern's pulse. Friday begins in near silence. The tavern above is quieter than usual, as though the whole village is nursing sore heads after the week's earlier feasting and quarrels. Down here in the cellar, the calm feels strange, almost too calm. The tun bubbles gently, steady as breathing, and the torchlight glints across the barrels. You stir slowly, waiting for the day to reveal its character. It does so in whispers, superstitions carried by those who work closest to fermentation. It begins with the innkeeper's wife, who descends the stairs carrying a bundle of dried herbs. She waves away your curious look, muttering that the ale needs protection from evil spirits. She sprinkles the herbs into the straw by the barrels, their fragrance sharp and unfamiliar. Mainstream historical fact: medieval brewers often relied on charms and rituals to protect their batches. With no knowledge of microorganisms, they explained spoilage through curses, bad luck, or the influence of malicious spirits. You watch as she tucks sprigs of rosemary and yarrow into the cracks of the beams, whispering words you can't quite hear. Quirky tidbit: in some regions, brewers placed horseshoes above their tuns, believing the iron warded off witches. Others carved crosses into barrel staves or recited prayers before stirring. You glance at your paddle, wondering if you ought to scratch a symbol into its handle. The thought makes you grin, though part of you hesitates. The cellar feels heavy with unseen forces when the torch sputters and shadows lengthen. Historians still argue whether these rituals were genuine beliefs or simply traditions passed down without question. Were brewers truly convinced of spirits in the foam, or did they mutter charms out of habit, the way modern workers knock on wood? You stir the tune slowly, letting the froth spread, and wonder. Perhaps both. Belief and routine often blend until they are indistinguishable. Joke number 1. You decide that yeast itself must be the most mischievous spirit of all. Silent, invisible, always bubbling with tricks. The innkeeper's wife finishes her circuit, nods firmly, and climbs back upstairs. The cellar smells sharper now, rosemary fighting with yeast for dominance. You resume your stirring, listening to the hiss of bubbles. The torch crackles, smoke curling upward. For a moment, you almost imagine faces in the foam, tiny eyes and mouths rising and vanishing with each pop. You shake your head, laughing softly at yourself, but the unease lingers. By midday, customers begin trickling in above. Their voices drift through the beams, muffled laughter mixed with grumbles. You climb the stairs halfway, peer through the crack, and see the innkeeper whispering with 2 patrons. They glance toward the trap door, as though the cellar itself holds secrets. You duck back down, amused. Joke number 2. If they think the cellar is haunted, maybe you should start charging admission. You sit on your stool, paddle across your lap, and think about how superstition wraps around every part of tavern life. A bad batch might be blamed on a wandering witch, a strange taste on a neighbor's curse. Cats were praised as guardians against evil, yet sometimes condemned as servants of it. Even spiders, whose webs shimmer faintly in the corners now, carried dual meanings. Luck to some, omens to others. You watch one spider crawl along its thread, perfectly calm, utterly indifferent to human debates. The cellar grows darker as clouds pass overhead, blocking the faint light that seeps between cracks. You light another torch, shadows shifting with the flame. The foam in the tun swirls, hiss louder now, as though feeding on your unease. You stir gently, slower than usual, almost irreverent. Whether you believe in charms or not, you respect the fragile alchemy unfolding here. Quirky tidbit number 2. In certain villages, brewers refuse to let strangers watch the fermentation, fearing an evil eye could sour the batch. Some even locked cellars with charms, treating them as sacred spaces. You glance at the trap door, imagining customers whispering about curses and witches while you hammer hoops and chase mice. Historians still argue whether these beliefs reflected genuine fear or were convenient excuses when ale spoiled. You suspect both. Joke number 3. You mutter to yourself that if witches truly wanted to curse ale, They'd only need to tip in a spoonful of eel pie. That would sour any batch. As the afternoon deepens, the innkeeper returns. This time carrying a small wooden cross. Without a word, he sets it against the largest tun, taps the spigot, and nods solemnly. You watch him go, torn between skepticism and comfort. The cross leans at a crooked angle, half ready to topple, but you leave it there. The cellar feels oddly steadier with it present, though you know the yeast doesn't care. The evening brings louder voices above. Someone sings, another shouts, laughter erupts. You remain below, content with your torch and bubbling tun. The cat pads back, leaps into your lap without warning, and curls into a warm weight. You scratch behind its ears, grateful for its purr. The cellar hums around you, charms tucked into beams, crosses leaning against casks, foam whispering with unseen life. You lean back, close your eyes, and let the day settle. Whether spirits hover in the shadows or not, the ale is alive, transforming. You're part of it, superstition or science, belief or habit. The cellar holds its mysteries, and you respect them, even if you smile at their strangeness. Tomorrow will bring more labor, more laughter, more arguments. Tonight, the yeast hisses softly, the cat purrs steadily, and you breathe easier in the dark. Saturday begins with the muffled toll of a church bell, its echo rolling through the village streets. Even in the cellar you can hear it, faint but steady, reminding everyone of duties owed. Today is tithe day, and that means some of the ale you've labored over will not fuel laughter or feasts, but instead find its way into the hands of the clergy. You sigh, stretching your sore arms, and glance at the barrels lined neatly against the wall. They gleam faintly in the torchlight, iron hoops snug from yesterday's repairs. One of them, you know, is destined for the church. You heft the first barrel onto its side, muscles protesting, and begin the long roll toward the stairs. Each thump reverberates in your bones, echoing like a drumbeat. The cat follows lazily, tail flicking, as if supervising your labor. At the top of the stairs, two young men hired for the day grab the cask, hoisting it onto a cart waiting outside. You step into the daylight briefly, squinting at the brightness. The village buzzes with activity, merchants shouting, children darting, and at the center of it all, the church doors wide open, ready to receive its due. Mainstream historical fact. Ale tithes were common in medieval Europe. The church often received part of a tavern's or brewer's output as rent, tax, or gift. Some monasteries even demanded barrels as offerings during feast days. The clergy preached temperance, yet they consumed heartily, their tables heavy with food and drink. You watch as the cart lurches forward, barrel rattling, bound for the church's storeroom. You retreat back into the cellar, shaking your head. Historians still argue whether the clergy's enthusiasm for ale undermined their sermons, or simply reflected the culture of the time. Some argue priests and monks were hypocrites, Others claim they simply shared the habits of their flock. Either way, the church bell tolls again, louder now, as if mocking your sweat. Quirky tidbit. In some parishes, ale blessed by the priest was thought to carry healing properties. Villagers carried mugs to the churchyard, sipping reverently as though it were medicine. You grin at the thought, imagining peasants pretending their third mug was purely medicinal. Joke number 1. You decide the clergy were the world's first inventors of doctor's orders. Take with food and repeat often. Back in the cellar, you check the tun. Foam still clings to the rim, yeast bubbling with steady determination. The spigot drips, faint trails of froth darkening the straw. You tighten it, wipe your hands, and pause to listen. The tavern above hums with softer voices than usual. Many patrons have followed the barrels to the church, gathering for services before the real drinking begins later. The cellar feels quieter without their noise seeping through the beams. You sit on your stool, paddle across your lap, and let your mind wander. Ole and faith. Strange companions, yet inseparable. Monasteries brewed vast quantities, their recipes guarded like relics. Parish feasts flowed with ale as freely as hymns. Pilgrims quenched thirst at taverns along the road, guided as much by the promise of drink as by holy shrines. Historians still argue whether ale strengthened religion by binding communities or weakened it by fueling excess. You suspect the truth lies in the middle, tangled like roots beneath the churchyard soil. The innkeeper stomps down, ledger in hand, muttering about lost profit. He scowls at the empty space where the tithe barrel once sat. God's share, he grumbles, shaking his head. You bite back a laugh, knowing better than to mock openly. The church takes what it will, and the tavern survives on what remains. He leaves again, slamming the trap door, boots echoing like the bell outside. The afternoon drifts by in steady rhythm. You patch a leaking seam, stir the tune gently, scrape away foam. The cellar smells sharp, sweet, damp. Shadows lengthen, torchlight glows warmer, and the cat curls into its favorite spot atop a barrel. You hear faint voices outside, the procession returning, villagers chattering about the sermon. Someone laughs, someone complains, someone sings a snatch of hymn off-key. Joke number 2. You wonder if the yeast downstairs feels more devout after hearing hymns through the floorboards. As evening falls, the tavern fills again. Customers stagger in after church, cloaks damp, cheeks red from chill. Their voices rise quickly, laughter louder than sermons. The barrels you labored over pour steadily, mugs clinking, songs replacing prayers. You roll another cask upstairs, watching foam gush into eager hands. The crowd toasts saints one moment, dice games the next. Faith and folly, intertwined like vines. Quirky tidbit number 2. Some feast days blurred the line entirely. Parish celebrations included ale contests, where villagers competed to see who could brew the strongest or drink the most. Officials sometimes frowned, but they joined in often enough. Historians still argue whether such customs reflected piety disguised as revelry or revelry disguised as piety. You lean against the wall, amused, watching villagers lift mugs skyward in toasts that sound suspiciously like prayers. Joke number 3. You mutter to yourself that if heaven has a tavern, its taps must run on endlessly, and its benches never wobble. By nightfall, the tavern roars with life. The lute strums, stomps echo. Laughter drowns out the church bell entirely. You retreat to the cellar, torch sputtering, ears ringing from the din above. The tun hisses, foam bubbles, barrels creak. The cat purrs in sleep. Spiders sway in webs. Mice scurry unseen. You sit on your stool, arms heavy, head bowed, listening to the rhythm of it all. Ale and faith, tavern and church, two worlds bound by barrels. Your labor flows into both, sustaining hymns and laughter alike. You close your eyes, letting exhaustion settle. Tomorrow will bring new tasks, new barrels, new arguments. Tonight, you rest in the cellar's embrace, content to let the yeast carry on its quiet devotion. Sunday morning greets you with a heaviness in your limbs and a stiffness in your back. The cellar feels colder today, though perhaps that is simply your muscles protesting after a week of labor. You lower yourself onto your stool, hands resting on your knees, and take in the sight around you. Rows of barrels leaning like weary companions, the tun still bubbling with quiet persistence, the cat grooming itself with smug calm. Today's work isn't so much about the ale itself, but about the toll it has taken on your body. You flex your hands. The skin across your palms has roughened, small blisters hardening into calluses. Your shoulders ache with a dull throb, a reminder of barrels rolled and buckets hauled. Even your nose has not escaped. Every breath you take is tinged with yeast, wood, and damp straw. Mainstream historical fact: brewers' bodies were shaped by their craft. Written records and illustrations show men and women with thickened arms, broad backs, and stooped postures, signs of constant hauling and stirring. You roll your shoulders, imagining yourself in some medieval woodcut, paddle in hand, sweat darkening your tunic. Quirky tidbit: some medieval jokes poked fun at brewers by claiming you could spot them from afar by the smell alone. Their hair and clothes reeked of malt and yeast, a fragrance so strong it clung to them like a badge of honor or shame. You chuckle softly, sniffing your sleeve, and admit the humor still applies. Joke number 1. If medieval brewers had invented perfume, it would have been called eau de mâche, guaranteed to repel noble suitors, but attract every mouse in the parish. You stand and stretch, wincing at the creak in your spine. The paddle feels heavier than usual when you lift it, though your arms know the motion well by now. You stir the tun gently, watching the foam shift. The yeast responds with a hiss, as though mocking your fatigue. You lean on the paddle, catching your breath, and wonder how many years a body could endure this routine. Historians still argue whether brewing was considered sustainable work for a lifetime, or whether many brewers shifted trades when their bodies failed. Looking at your hands, you suspect the latter. The cat leaps onto a barrel, watching you with half-lidded eyes. Its movements are fluid, effortless, unburdened by aching joints or blistered palms. You shake your head, muttering about unfairness. Joke number 2. You imagine taverns should hire cats as apprentices, lighter on the barrels, quicker on the feet, and much less likely to complain about wages. You set the paddle aside and walk the rows of barrels. Your legs feel leaden, your knees stiff. Each step reminds you that brewing isn't just work of the arms. It seeps into every muscle, every joint. You rub your lower back, groaning quietly, and pause to lean against a cask. The wood is cool, the iron hoop pressing into your shoulder. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the barrel's solidity steady you. Mainstream historical fact number 2. Ale wasn't just sustenance for villagers, it was sustenance for brewers themselves. Laborers in breweries often consumed large amounts of ale daily, partly as hydration, partly as calories. You wonder whether drinking more of your own product might dull the ache, though the irony of self-medication with ale doesn't escape you. Joke number 3. You muse that medieval health advice might have read, "For sore muscles, apply 1 pint internally. Repeat as necessary." The day creeps forward slowly. You patch a leaking seam, shift a lighter cask, stir the tun again. Each task weighs more heavily than usual, as though your body resists. Yet there's satisfaction in endurance. You look at the foam rising, at the barrels standing firm, and remind yourself that your aches prove your role in sustaining the tavern. Historians still argue whether physical labor in trades like brewing brought dignity or degradation. You feel both: dignity in the craft, degradation in the soreness. By midday, the tavern above stirs louder. Voices drift through the beams, laughter, clatter, the scrape of mugs. You sit again, letting the noise wash over you. The cellar feels like the tavern's lungs, hidden, unseen, but breathing life into every sound above. Your body may ache, but the tavern thrives because of it. You smile faintly, despite the pain. The cat leaps down, rubs against your leg, and purrs. You scratch its head, grateful for the small comfort. The spiders sway silently in their webs, indifferent but steady. The yeast bubbles, tireless, never aching. You envy its endless energy, though you suspect even yeast tires eventually, just invisibly. Evening falls, torchlight deepens, shadows lengthen. Your body feels heavier with every hour. You slump against the wall, paddle leaning beside you, and let your eyes drift closed. The cellar hums softly, drips, hisses, purrs. You breathe deeply, ignoring the ache in your shoulders, the throb in your back. You remind yourself that strength grows from repetition, that endurance builds in silence. Tomorrow will demand more. More stirring, more hauling, more aching. But for now, you sit among the barrels, body weary, spirit steady. Brewing has marked you, shaping your muscles, your posture, even your scent. You belong to the cellar as much as the yeast, the cat, or the spiders. And though your body complains, your heart accepts. Monday dawns with the low murmur of voices above, quieter than the usual tavern roar, but sharper in tone. When you push open the trap door to deliver a small cask, you quickly understand why. Politics. Not the kind with crowns and parliaments, but the kind that slithers through every village. Alliances, feuds, debts, favors. You ease the cask into a corner, listening as the arguments swell. A farmer leans close to the reeve, whispering urgently. A merchant waves his hand dismissively, voice raised. A man in a cloak watches from the shadows, sipping ale as if patience were his weapon. You retreat to the cellar, cask emptied of your labor, but full of echoes. Down below, the tun hisses steadily, its song unbothered by schemes above. You sit on your stool, paddle across your lap, and think about how ale oils more than throats. Mainstream historical fact: taverns often doubled as meeting places where deals were struck, disputes negotiated, and alliances sealed. Charters and contracts might be drafted formally elsewhere, but many agreements began over mugs. The cellar sustains more than laughter. It sustains quiet bargains, shaping the village's future. You roll another cask upstairs later, careful to keep your head down. The men at the table fall silent when you pass, eyes flicking toward you. You keep moving, roll the cask to the tap, and leave quickly. Back in the cellar, your heart thuds louder than the drip from the beams. Historians still argue whether tavern politics strengthened local communities or corroded them with backroom deals. You suspect the answer, as always, lies somewhere in the froth. The cat slinks across the barrels, tail flicking, as if it too senses the tension. You scratch its ears absently, grateful for its steady purr. Joke number 1. You whisper that if the cat sat at the table upstairs, it would probably negotiate better rates than half the men there. You turn back to your tasks. The tune demands another stir, bubbles rising in gentle protest as the paddle cuts through foam. Your shoulders ache, but the rhythm steadies you. You think of guilds in cities, alewives in villages, merchants crossing seas, each shaped by politics tied to ale. This cellar may feel hidden, but the ripples from its barrels reach farther than you can see. By midday, the noise above grows sharper. A mug slams, voices rise, chairs scrape. You freeze, listening. Then laughter bursts, sudden and loud, as if the argument has been smoothed over by drink. You exhale, tension slipping from your shoulders. Quirky tidbit: some medieval contracts were literally sealed with ale. Witnesses drank together, toasting agreements, believing that shared mugs bound words as firmly as ink. You grin faintly at the thought. Joke number 2. You imagine future historians poring over spilled ale stains on parchment and declaring them legally binding. The innkeeper stomps down. Face flushed, eyes narrowed. He mutters about fools upstairs, how they shout more than they pay. He checks the barrels, nods at the patched hoops, and sighs. Politics, he growls, shaking his head. You offer no reply. He leaves again, boots echoing, mutters fading into the roar above. You stir again, slowly, watching foam cling to the paddle. Your arms are heavy, your back stiff, but your mind drifts to the question of power. How many decisions in history were shaped not in courts or castles, but in taverns like this one? Deals whispered over mugs, promises sealed with handshakes, slick with ale. Historians still argue whether such informal politics truly mattered, or whether they were simply background noise. Sitting in this cellar, you're convinced they mattered more than most records admit. The torch sputters, shadows dancing across the beams. The cat yawns, curling tighter. The spiders sway in their webs, indifferent. You rest the paddle against the tun, lean back against the cool stone wall, and close your eyes for a moment. The hiss of yeast blends with muffled voices above, forming a strange harmony. Quiet labor below, noisy politics above, one sustaining the other. As evening falls, you climb the stairs once more. The tavern is quieter now, though tension lingers in the air. The men at the table sip in silence, eyes darting, words unspoken. You roll another cask to the tap, careful not to meet their gaze, and retreat again. Back in the cellar, The torch glows faintly, the foam swirls steadily, and your shoulders relax. Joke number 3. You mutter to yourself that yeast is the only honest politician in the building. It works tirelessly, asks nothing but sugar, and always delivers results. The night deepens. Voices upstairs fade into snores. Chairs creak, and the lute strums one last clumsy chord before silence. You sit in the cellar, paddle beside you, torch burning low. The barrels loom in rows, steady as always, their secrets sealed tight. You breathe in the damp, yeasty air and let exhaustion settle into your bones. Politics may rage above, but down here, the work is simple, steady, and endlessly patient. Tomorrow will bring another round of labor, another cycle of noise. But tonight, the cellar belongs to you, the cat, the spiders, and the tireless yeast. You close your eyes, letting the hum of fermentation lull you. Whatever politics unfold upstairs, you know history is brewed in places like this. Quietly, steadily, one barrel at a time. By week's end, the cellar feels like part of your own body. You know every drip from the beams, every groan of the barrels, every twitch of straw where a mouse might dart. Your arms ache, your back protests, your hands smell permanently of grain and yeast, but the rhythm of the week has carved itself into you. You sit on your stool, paddle leaning against the tun, and let your eyes wander across the rows of casks that now stand filled, patched, and ready. The tavern above hums softly, not the roar of a feast or the shouting of disputes, but a gentler murmur, neighbors sharing quiet mugs, weary workers slumped over benches, the minstrel strumming softly, less goose-like tonight, more mournful. The cellar receives the echoes, faint and steady, and you breathe them in like a reward. Mainstream historical fact. Taverns at the close of the week often served as places of reflection, as much as celebration, where debts were tallied, wages shared, and prayers offered before the cycle began anew. You stir the tun lazily, though its foam has nearly stilled. as though even the yeast knows rest is due. The cat leaps gracefully into your lap, curling tight and purring loudly. You scratch its ears absent-mindedly, grateful for the warmth. Your body feels heavier than usual, though also steadier, as if it has adapted to the strain. Historians still argue whether brewers were respected artisans or dismissed as laborers. Sitting here, you suspect both are true. The work is invisible upstairs, but without it, no laughter would ring, no deals would be struck, no feasts would feel whole. Quirky tidbit. In some chronicles, brewers were even accused of trickery, watering down ale, overcharging, or hoarding yeast. Yet the same records admit that when taverns ran dry, whole villages grumbled. You grin faintly, imagining customers upstairs, cursing brewers one moment, and begging for refills the next. Joke number 1. Perhaps the true power in the village isn't the reeve or the priest, but the brewer hiding in the cellar. You lean back, closing your eyes. The cellar hums in its usual chorus. Drip, hiss, faint scurry. The torch crackles. Shadows sway. The barrels loom like old companions, whispering of feasts, quarrels, songs, and sermons. The week has been long, filled with sweat and aches, yet also threaded with small satisfactions. A patched hoop that held, a batch that bubbled true, a feast that filled the hall. You smile faintly, feeling the weight of both exhaustion and accomplishment. The cat shifts, tail flicking, then settles again. The yeast bubbles faintly, as if sighing. You think of the villagers, sleeping with bellies full and throats soothed, never knowing how many times you stirred, hammered, or hauled to keep their mugs brimming. Historians still argue whether brewing shaped communities more than fields or markets. You look at the rows of barrels and whisper, yes, knowing no plow or ledger carries quite the same laughter. Joke number 2. You imagine a medieval motto for brewers: invisible, indispensable, and always slightly sticky. You laugh quietly, startling the cat, who blinks reproachfully. You stroke its fur, murmuring apologies, and fall back into the cellar's rhythm. Evening deepens, shadows lengthen, and the torch burns low. You rise slowly, joints creaking, and give the tun one final stir. The foam swirls gently, bubbles rise, then settle. You set the paddle aside, wipe your hands on your tunic, and glance across the cellar one last time. The barrels stand ready. The cat curls into sleep. The spiders glisten in their webs. The mice scurry faintly in the straw. Everything hums with the promise of another week, another cycle, another rhythm of labor and laughter. Joke number 3. You whisper that if eternity is just stirring, hauling, patching, and listening to bubbles, at least eternity comes with ale. The cellar seems to agree, its chorus steady, eternal. You sink back onto your stool, letting the quiet embrace you. The week ends here, in the damp underworld, where history is brewed drop by drop. You close your eyes, hearing the faint murmur from above, and allow yourself to rest, content that the cellar will keep breathing until tomorrow. Now the pace softens, the words stretch longer, the breath slows. The cellar that felt busy with tasks now feels hushed, like a lullaby. You sit with the barrels not as burdens, but as companions, their silence steady, their weight reassuring. The cat purrs in rhythm. The torch flickers lower. The straw rustles faintly. Everything fades into gentler shapes. You picture the week folding behind you like a cloak carefully set aside. The hauling, the stirring, the hammering, the quarrels, the laughter, they blur into one steady memory of labor and quiet triumphs. Your arms, though sore, feel lighter now, as if they, too, understand that rest is part of the work. The hiss of the yeast softens to a whisper, a fading song you no longer need to tend. The cellar breathes more slowly, matching your own breath. Steady, patient, unhurried. You imagine the tavern above quiet at last, benches empty, mugs abandoned, embers glowing low in the hearth. The voices are gone, but their echoes linger like gentle ripples. You are left with calm, with silence, with the company of still barrels and steady walls. Shadows lengthen, not sharply, but in blurred lines, as though the cellar itself is drowsy. Your thoughts wander no further. They drift like foam across cooling ale, spreading wider, thinner, until they vanish altogether. You feel the stone at your back, the straw beneath your feet, the weight of the air like a blanket. You close your eyes, your breathing deepens, and the week dissolves into calm. The cellar is still, the barrels are steady, the night is gentle,